Many people are quickly to reply, and an outward sign of an inward decision. Okay? Well, that's actually not a quote from Scripture. But I will agree with that it is a sign. It is a sign. We can all agree that it is a sign, but it's a sign of what? Now let me be clear up a common misunderstanding. I'm going to say it over and over again. The Reformed position is that baptism is just a sign. It in no way is guaranteed salvation, nor does it remove any sin, original or other. It's an outward sign. And we'll get to see that a little bit more of how that works out. But the question is, what is baptism a sign of? Is it just a sign of believing only? Or is it more than believing? Is it a sign greater or more than that? Let me regress for a moment. We understand that in the Old Testament, God marked His people with a sign. The sign was to show the whole world whose people these were. The sign of the Old Testament covenant was the mark of, and we'll remember the mark of a follower of God in the Old Testament. He said you should be circumcised. That was the mark. In fact, we see this in Abraham in Genesis 17, 9 through 14. And God said to Abraham, "As for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and your descendants after you. Every male child among you shall be circumcised, and you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin. And it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you." Sign of the covenant between me and you. "He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised, every male child in your generations. He who is born in your household or bought with money from any foreigner who is not your descendant. He who is born in your household and he who is bought with your money must be circumcised. And my covenant shall be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. And the uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant." So the sign, the mark, this way of showing who was in the covenant, who was out of the covenant, that mark was circumcision. Page 4. And from that time, if a male was born into that family, he was to be circumcised on the 8th day. Now, a quick side note about that, how cool God is. Did you know that your blood doesn't coagulate, doesn't form clots until the 8th day? So if you circumcised a child before the 8th day, they would bleed. Now, children now get a shot to make that happen faster. But that was amazing. It's almost like God created them. It's a novel concept. So in the Old Testament, there were 2 types of circumcision. We saw 2 types of people commanded to be circumcised. There was confessing circumcision or believer's circumcision and infant circumcision, recognizing circumcision doesn't save you. Now the confessing circumcision, one too many, was performed on one who entered the covenant as an adult, i.e., Abraham entered the covenant as an adult, thus he had the confessing circumcision. He was to be circumcised. If a man came out of a non-Jewish home from that point on, and he was converted to Judaism, he was required to be circumcised. Because of this requirement of circumcision, many believers in God didn't become full Jews. You can sort of understand why. They were God-fearers because they were also circumcised-fearers, which I can understand. This person believed in God, but they did not take the final step of entering the covenant through circumcision. Now, this circumcision, was that the one performed on Abraham and his entire household? So, that is confessing circumcision. Those that confess God being part of the covenant. But once a child was born into Abraham's house, a different circumcision took place. infant circumcision was not because the infant had shown any belief in God. Did Isaac show any belief? Did Jacob? Any of those? When they're born, they were not showing any belief. It wasn't because they had shown something in and of themselves. The infant was circumcised because God's promises was not just to Abraham, but to his descendants as well. Let me re-say that. The infant was circumcised because God's promise was not just to Abraham, but to his descendants as well. Okay? So we sort of understand the mark of the old covenant was circumcision. Okay? The Abrahamic covenant. Now the new covenant sign. Now I've gone through this. What's the sign of the New Testament covenant? How does he mark his people? Is it still by circumcision? No, the Greeks were not commanded to circumcise. God had changed the sign and the fulfillment of the Old Testament covenant to something else, and we find that in Colossians 2, 11 through 12. But I want to say this, and I think it's a sad mark to all of us, that when I talk to people about this, because people go, "You're baptizing Caitlin? Really? That's sort of weird." I say, well, and I start going through this argument. What's the sign of the Old Testament covenant? And a little prodding, and they'll get circumcision out of them. What's the sign of the New Testament covenant? And no one knows the answer. I mean, once I say the answer, they go, "Oh, yeah, I totally understand." And y'all probably know what it is because we're here to baptize Caitlin. It's probably a good guess it's baptism. But anyway, we don't understand that, which is a sadness to all of us, that we aren't being taught the full picture. Like I said, an elephant's like a trunk, an elephant's like a tree. We need the whole picture. Let's look in Colossians 2, 11 through 12. In him you were also circumcised with the circumcision made without hands, by putting off the body of the sin of the flesh, by the circumcision of Christ, buried with him in baptism, in which you also were raised in him through faith in the working of God, who raised him from the dead. So the new mark of the new covenant is not circumcision. We know that because circumcision wasn't commanded. What is commanded to believers? Baptism. So just as the circumcision was the mark of the Old Testament covenant, baptism is the mark of the New Testament covenant. Let me re-emphasize. It doesn't save you. It's just to mark you as part of the covenant. But now many want to restrict their children from this blessing. Just in the Old Testament, there were two types of circumcision. In the New Testament, there are two different types of baptism, confessing and infant. When someone comes out, just as if someone came out of a non-Jewish home and was converted to Judaism, they were to be circumcised to be part of the covenant. When someone comes out of a non-Christian home into Christianity, they are to be baptized. That is confessing baptism, or believer's baptism, which we all agree. There we go. If baptism is similar to circumcision as the mark of the covenant, then we should not only see confessing baptism, but entire households being baptized in the Scriptures. What I'm saying is, if it's not just individuals, we should see households being baptized in the Scripture. And that's what we find in Acts and in 1 Corinthians. Now, if we could find a Scripture of an infant being raised in a Christian home and baptized as an adult, we could say infant baptism is wrong. Infant baptism is proven wrong. If we could find an example of an infant being born into a Christian home, raised up in a Christian home, and being baptized as an adult, as we've seen a lot of time today, we could say that scripturally it's not the case, but there is no case. This is why infant baptism is so confusing to some. Hear me. The reason that every adult was baptized in the Scripture is because no one had been raised in a Christian home. The reason that you see so much of confessing or believer's baptism was because no one was a Christian yet. Christianity had just started. Just as the first generation of Abraham's family, when Abraham was commanded to circumcise, how many infant circumcisions happened that day? Probably not any. How many confessing circumcisions happened that day? A whole lot. It's the same way when they were sharing the gospel. People were coming to Christ for the first time. Them and their families.
Who am I that the Lord of all the earth would care to know my name, would care to feel my hurt? Who am I that the bright and morning star would choose to light the way